Well, every road I see leads away from me. There's not a single one that leads me home. The road keeps saying, friend, come see what's round the bend. So is it any wonder that I roam? All the places I have been keep calling me back again. Down in the pines I hear the cold winds blow. My heart keeps telling me, foot loose and fancy free. And the road goes by and calls me as it goes. Well, maybe somewhere there's a someone waiting with a smile. And maybe there'll be some place I can stop and rest a while. And maybe you weren't meant to be just a rolling stone. And there's a road to travel on that leads you back to home.
All right, everybody. All right, it's been a while. I think if I remember right, I did do a live chat, just kind of an impromptu one after I got back up here to Wyoming. But this is the first official one. So this is Tales of the Trails episode number whatever in the heck it was. And it was supposed to be on the horse meat march. But my books on the horse meat march are buried, and things have just been crazy since I got back here to Wyoming, and I haven't had a chance to read it. But I started reading up a little more in depth on Red Cloud's War, and so I'm going to show a couple books here that I highly recommend. Actually, it's a 2-volume to the same thing. But if you're looking for a great read on Red Cloud's War, McDermott's books, Red Cloud's War, Volume 1 and Volume 2, excellent reading. And so I've been reading up on them. That's why we decided to do Red Cloud's War tonight. And this will probably wind up being a 2-part series because I'm still in the first volume and working my way through. I've only got like 20, 30 pages left before I get into the appendices, the extra stuff. But for the meat of it, this one, it gets you through the Fetterman Massacre. So it kind of gets the first part of Red Cloud's War in there.
Those books look cheap.
When they were in print, they were $70 a piece. Now they're about $150 if you can find them. If
that's
lucky,
what I'm saying.
For $85.
That looks like a really nice set.
Yeah. Well, when they was in print, I was going to buy a set of them, but I didn't have the money, and now I wished I would have because they're out of print, so they've gone up in price. But anyway, they had them at work, and I checked them out, and I've been reading up on them. I got through most of this in one day, and I've just been kind of taking little nips at it since then because things have gotten pretty busy. But so I'm in kind of at the point where Carrington is being replaced right after the Fetterman Massacre, and then it's going to get into Fort C.F. Smith in that next chapter, and then I should be just about finished with it. And then on book 2, that gets into Wagon Box and the hayfield and kind of some of the other stuff that's going on, Court of Inquiry. But goes through 1867 and then eventually the peace treaties. But anyway, as usual, I usually have Garrett read off the chat here and kind of see who's on so I can kind of get my thoughts organized on how I'm going to start this thing.
Okay. We have AR American is in. Stephen M. Mann is in. Diane Houston says hello. Louisiana Gray is here. He says, good evening, fellows. He said, I see more of us patiently waiting. Let's see here. Chris Klein is in. Yeah, Louisiana Gray said, I see we're only broadcasting on Duke's channel. This is Duke's show.
Yeah. We've been trying that here. The last one we did on just my channel, if I remember right, So yeah, we're trying to move everything over onto this one, but if the viewership goes down, we'll go back to doing it on our channels.
Yeah. This is all Duke's work, so Duke should get the credit for it. I just sit here.
Yeah.
Chris
Basically,
Klein
what's
said,
been happened is I'm just the talent now. Garrett does all the organizing of it.
yeah, but you do all the reading. That's the
I do all the
main part.
reading. Garrett takes care of the YouTube side of things. I take care of the history, the talent side of things.
Let's see. We have Doug Dukes is here. He said, "Evening all."
All right.
Christopher Mead, by land and sea. Hey, Doc. He's
Hey.
here. You guys didn't catch him last week. He was on this channel too, even though Duke couldn't be here.
I caught about 2 seconds. I was busy that night.
Yep. Serpent Hanzo's here. Very nice
hey,
intro.
I remember your name.
Hardy said, "Hello, you silly humans," and he said he just got his first copy of Six Guns.
Yeah, I need to find my copy of that, but yeah,
Yep.
Good book, excellent choice.
Gotta have that one in your if you're a collector.
In the words of Phil Robinson, gotta have it.
Caleb and Mom left this morning at 2:30, and they're just out.
CBJW. Oh, that's Caleb's channel. Okay.
Yeah, and he's just they're just this side of Oklahoma or Kansas line now, I think. So they've almost made it all the way from Kansas to Austin and back in one day. So they've had quite a trip.
I can't believe Caleb did that to his mother.
You don't know Caleb. Caleb and I come all the way from North Carolina back to Western Kansas one day too, and that was quite a trip. And we even stopped in Tennessee for about 2 hours. So
I ain't got room to talk. My grandmother come up with my uncle one year to pick me up from college, come home for Christmas, and I made him turn around and go all the way back, and that was an 8-hour drive.
Louisiana Gray said, "You do a good job." Jay Wheeler's in. Brandon Birch, a lot of people in tonight. Said, "Howdy, fellas. All set to get some learning." Atlatl Man. Time for another episode of my favorite history podcast. Leroy Frazier. Dryball Jimmy here. I take it that's one of your crew.
Yeah, that's my uncle. He got the name Dryball Jimmy one day. I'll tell that quick story. I was out there shooting a video, and I think I was messing around with my brown vest. It's now Ethan's brown vest. And he was over there loading, and he goes to shoot, and nothing happens. So we're sitting there fiddling with it. We spent about 20 minutes. Well, before that, he had dry-balled one round, and then we spent 20 minutes, and we thought he dry-balled another one. Come to find out, he hadn't even loaded it. He got to watching me, forgot to load the gun, and we're sitting there trying to get a gun to go off. I ain't got no ammunition in it. And that's when I started calling him Dryball Jimmy. And I think in that video I call him Dryball Jimmy, and that's just kind of where it come from.
Kind of like I said in my last video last Sunday, if you're muzzle loading a lot, it's not if, it's just when.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to happen.
You get into the motion, and then you'll have a brain fart, and things don't work.
I'm sitting there talking to the camera, and I dryballed right on camera the other day. But the good news is, if you don't know if your powder's bad or you dryballed, you can always rewind and see the dumb mistake you just made.
Yep.
So anyway, a couple more things here. Okay, Mom said she's in a hurry so she can sleep at home. Saboteur 45's in.
Hey, Saboteur.
By my land and sea said just made it to Colorado. He's been traveling across country. Stopped at Fort Hays, was very impressed with what was still there. Doug Duke said, glad to hear your family escaped from Austin. Hardy says, if you shoot smoke poles and haven't dryballed at least a few times, you haven't shot smoke poles enough. LOL. And that's it. We have 30 people in.
Dang, we're doing pretty good here. All righty, so we're going to get right into Red Cloud's War. So if you haven't gathered by the chats we've done on here, this is very Northern Plains Indian Wars heavy, has been for a while. And that's because I work up here at Fort Laramie, which was kind of in the center of most of what was going on in the middle to late 1800s. But to kind of set the stage, and I do this for all the newbies. So for those of you that heard it before, you'll probably hear it another time here. set the stage. Fort Laramie gets established in 1849. A couple of years later, they're going to have the first major peace treaty here in 1851 that's organized by Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, who's the Indian agent for the Upper Platte and Arkansas Indian Agency. So basically everything in Colorado and Wyoming. And he was part of Fort Laramie before it was Fort Laramie. He come out during the Fort William days, was part of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company before it went under, was put under by the American Fur Company. And long story short, he becomes the Indian agent. First established at Bent's Fort down in Colorado, which would become known as Bent's Old Fort later on when he builds a new one a short distance away. Once he becomes the Indian agent, of course, Bent abandons the post. And so he's going to start to operate more out of the Fort Laramie area, and he's going to organize a peace council essentially because in 1849, you have a mass amount of people heading for California on the gold trails. And not only that, they're heading down the Santa Fe Trail as well. And so this puts tension with the Native Americans because prior to that, most of the travel on trails had been fairly insignificant. And excuse me, I got a stem on my tobacco. It's biting me in the cheek. In 1849, it gets to be a pretty significant amount, 45,000 people on one estimate for the Oregon Trail traffic alone, over, a couple thousand the year before. So that tension, it not only puts tension on natives, it's putting tension on the resources as well, which is one of the reasons why the natives are upset because the game is being driven away from the trails. And so Fitzpatrick decides, well, they need to make a peace treaty to guarantee safe passage. And in 1851, it gets organized. Several Northern Plains tribes arrive at Fort Laramie. And at first, the government thought it would just be the leaders of the tribes. No, it was the whole tribes. About 10,000 people participated in the treaty. So yeah, it's whole villages. In fact, there were so many people and the goods were so long delayed that they finally started moving eastward and basically would have discussions every day. And as the horses would graze up the grass, they'd move eastward. Eventually they get to a place called Horse Creek in Nebraska, which is about 40 miles from Fort Laramie. It's not too far from the town of Henry, Nebraska. And so they're going to, or where the Horse Creek meets the Platte, they're going to finalize that treaty there. So that's why the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty is also called the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty. And under that treaty, it basically states, kind of identifies where the native tribes are located at. It's not really setting reservations, saying this is absolute their land. It's kind of like where they're at, and makes the agreement that they'll get $50,000 worth of annuities every year for 50 years in payment for use of the Oregon Trail, essentially. Tribes agreed to it. Of course, Congress kicks it back and changes things, and it never really gets adopted after that point by either side because natives thought it was one and done. Congress made changes, sent it back, and the Indians said, no, we already agreed to this. We're not going to come in and do that all over again. And so it just kind of gets laid by the side, and Congress never formally adopts the 1851 treaty. And so a few years later, or I should say about a year later, a group of Minneconjous, which did not participate in the treaty, kind of fed up and with the army and the travelers coming through, and a couple men attack some soldiers at a ferry, the ferry that's right at Fort Laramie. And because of that, then the soldiers go out and attack the village. They kill a few people. It's basically just kind of a quick thing, nothing major scale. However, one of the men killed is brother to a man named High Forehead. The following year, 1853, a High Forehead with a handful of other Minneconjous are with the Ogallala and the Brules down a few miles below Fort Laramie, close to what was known as the Gratiot House, where the annuities that Congress had kicked back to $10,000 worth of annuities for 10 years, Oregon Trail traffic. The annuities were being stored there, and the Ogallalas and the Lakotas had come together to basically wait for the Indian agent to come give them their goods, give them their annuities before they go off and start find a place for their winter camps. And so travelers are coming down the trail at that time of the year, which is in August. That's the time of the year when the Mormon trains are coming through. Because unlike the Oregon Trail and California Trail traffic, the Mormons only got to get to Utah, which is a third of the way shorter than California, so they can be traveling through this area in August and be perfectly safe. And so there's about half a dozen different stories at this point what happens next, but one account says that High Forehead stole a cow from the Mormons. Another account says that the cow was left behind and was wandering. Another account says that the cow just got loose and ran through camp and the Mormons left it. What we know 100% for sure is that High Forehead killed the cow and ate it. Because people have been waiting here for a little bit, and food was starting to become a little bit of an issue. And so Lieutenant Fleming, of course, is going to get word. The person that lost the cow reports it as being stolen because the Mormons are financially responsible for everything that the church provides them to come on that trail, including that cow. And so that Mormon person would have had to pay for the cow when he got to Utah. So he stops and files a complaint with Lieutenant Fleming at Fort Laramie, and Lieutenant Fleming was commanding officer. And Fleming decides to hold up the end of the 51 treaty that, basically says people are to be held accountable for their crimes on both sides. And so Lieutenant Grattan, and this is not commissioned Lieutenant Grattan, it's brevet Lieutenant Grattan, because Grattan didn't get his commission when he graduated from West Point. He was bottom of his class. He was breveted, sent out to the West. That's pretty much the best way to kill your military career before it ever gets even a chance to get started. And so Grattan's kind of in a panic, like, how am I going to, advance my career? And when this happens, he sees it as an opportunity to make a name for himself. Excuse me.
And he will be remembered for years to come.
Excuse me.
He's even got a plaque on the side of the highway out there. I seen it.
Yeah, a little Wyoming State Highway. So Grattan rounds up right at 30 men, including a couple civilians, one of which was the fort interpreter, August Lucien. And Lucien decides, well, they're probably going to go down there and get killed, so he's going to get drunk. And so he purchases a bottle of hard alcohol and just starts draining it. Grattan rounds up the men, gets them in wagons. He takes with him a 12-pound mountain howitzer and a 12-pound field howitzer. And if you wonder what the difference is, field howitzer is on a carriage with wheels about 5 foot tall. Mountain howitzer, the wheels are about 3 foot tall. So about double the size of the mountain howitzer for the field. Anyway, Grattan rounds him up, takes the bottle away from Lucien, throws it away, tells him, basically, don't be a sissy, let's go, this is nothing. And they start down the trail. They head 6 miles down to where the Oglala camp is at. Now, 6 miles, that doesn't seem like a lot for us today, but these folks are traveling in a wagon. So it's probably going to take about half a day to reach that location. Maybe not quite a full half a day, but it's going to take a while to reach the camp. And when Grattan arrives, he's greeted by Conquering Bear, and Conquering Bear basically says the man won't give himself up, tries to pay for the cow, tries all kinds of different ways to peacefully bring about a resolution, including offering to kill High Forehead himself and bring the dead body to the fort. Grattan ain't having it, and August Lucien's not translating very well because on the way he found out another soldier had a bottle of whiskey, bought it off of him, and continued to get drunk on the way down there. And he was not fond of the Lakota, even though he was married to a Lakota woman. And so several Indians realized that, the interpreter is the one that's causing problems. So they go to James Bordeaux's trading post, which is just a half mile away. tell him that they need an interpreter or there's going to be a fight. And before Bordeaux can even get there, he realizes he's already too late. And Grattan is going to decide to use force. And it's worth noting that Grattan's lowest demerits were in infantry and artillery tactics. And so he sets the howitzer to take out the tops of teepees, both howitzers. And the infantry discharge their muskets and don't even have a chance to reload before they're pretty well overrun and wiped out within 20 minutes. After that, the natives are pretty well fed up. Concrete Bear's mortally wounded, but he keeps telling the natives, don't attack the immigrants. It's not the immigrants' fault. Just fight the soldiers. And they first raid the Gratiot house because they figure at that point they're not going to get their annuities. So they raid the Gratiot house, take all the annuities. Then they go to James Bordeaux's house. One native that tries to kill Bordeaux. Another chief stops that Indian, says, no, Bordeaux's been fair to us. And at that point, Bordeaux just starts giving out goods and because he figures he's going to be killed if he doesn't. So he basically helps him rob his store. And then several natives want to go to Fort Laramie and wipe the rest of them out. And it could have easily been done because at this point, Fort Laramie is a one-company post, 75 troops, 25 of which have been sent to Laramie Peak on a woodcutting detail, leaving 50. Grattan took 30 with him down there. And so that left just about 20 troopers at Fort Laramie. And once they realized what had happened, all of the soldiers fall into the walls of Old Fort John because Old Fort John's still standing. And they use it as a palisade. And after the natives raid the Gratiot house, Bordeaux's house, chiefs kind of get them calmed down and said, no, let's not worry about soldiers now. We need to get out of here and start worrying about getting ready for winter because it's August. That's where you got to start laying in meat before the winter hits. And so they're going to take off and head back north. Things are going to calm down a little bit at Fort Laramie. But the following year, General Harney of the Dragoons decides that, you know, the Indians need to be chastised at this point. He goes on a vengeance raid, and he's going to come across a village at Blue Water Creek, or Ash Hollow, as it's known today over in Nebraska. And he's going to attack that village, killing several hundred people, men, women, and children included. And that's going to start what's known as the First Sioux War, and that'll go on for a couple of years. After that, things get quiet for a little bit longer, but the Denver Gold Rush is going to put strain on relations again. As more and more people coming into the West. This time they're coming into Colorado, and they're, you know, imposing on territory of the Southern Cheyenne. So the Southern Cheyenne pretty well occupy everything from the North Platte River, between that and the Arkansas River. Northern Cheyenne are further up in the northern country, more in the Fort Laramie area. And so the Southern Cheyenne are at first they're okay with, you know, the whites coming in and taking the gold. And it's like, yeah, come in and take the gold. Once you've got it, leave. We have no use for the gold. You can have it. And as more and more people come in, towns, permanent settlements start to show up. Denver shows up. And Southern Cheyenne aren't real happy about it, but at the same time, they realize they really can't fight them off. There's kind of a split there. There's several peace chiefs, including Black Kettle, that think we're not going to be able to fight them off, so we need to get the best deal we can. Other chiefs do want to fight, of course. And Black Kettle does his best to maintain peace, and he's basically going to pay for his attempts. As I say, no good deed goes unpunished. And trusting the government, trusting John Shivington, he goes to Sand Creek as instructed to be waiting to be escorted back to Fort Lyon to negotiate peace. And on November 29th, 1864, Shivington arrives. And at first, Black Kettle thinks they're going to be escorted in for their peace talks. And Shivington attacks the village and wipes out, you know, several hundred, again, men, women, and children. But this is a little bit different than when Harney attacked the Brule in Nebraska, and the fact that afterwards the soldiers are going to heavily mutilate the bodies of the Cheyenne people that they killed. And for our young viewers, I'm not going to get into what they did, but it was not a nice thing. I'll basically put it that way. It was appalling. The whole country was appalled by what had happened. Shivington thought it was going to be his way into politics, but everybody in the nation was absolutely appalled by it. And of course, it's going to make it to where now the Cheyenne don't want peace. They want to fight. They want revenge for Sand Creek. And that's going to lead to the 1865 Indian War. And so as they go on in the beginning of 1865, they're going to attack the town of Julesburg. Not once, they're going to attack it twice. First, it's going to be, it's Fort Sedgwick is there, but before that, it was Camp Ranker. Cannot remember, Camp something with an R. Anyway, it becomes Fort Sedgwick. There's military posts there. The Indians first try to attack that, realize that they can't do it because it's too heavily fortified, but the town of Julesburg is left unprotected. And so they'll sack the town of Julesburg. And soldiers were actually able to find out where they were encamped because the sacks of flour and corn that the Indians took from Julesburg, well, that left a trail, as some of them dumped out right back to where their camp was. But of course, it was too late for the troops to do anything by this point. Once Julesburg is attacked, troops from Fort Laramie are called out. Members of the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, about 125 men, are going to be sent to Julesburg as basically a relief column. A short while later, the natives are going to attack a stage station at Mud Springs, and that's going to follow by an attack on their village at Rush Creek. Battle of Mud Springs and Battle of Rush Creek, very close together. The Cheyenne and Arapaho and the members of the Lakota that are taking part in this war, active part, realize that there's too much attention. Troops are being brought into Colorado, and so they're going to start moving north into the Powder River country, which is not heavily occupied. In fact, there's hardly any white folks in that country at all. They're going to go up into that country because they figure they can escape from there and then still attack the army outposts and such that's in this Wyoming territory. Later that year, middle of summer, they will attack Platte River Bridge, where Casper Collins, who's the son of William Collins, is killed trying to rescue a detachment of the 11th Kansas Cav that was basically going to be riding right into an ambush. And as he rides out to try to stop him, try to rescue him, troopers from the other side of the bridge at the post say that they could see an arrow come in, basically hit him right between the eyes, and that's the end of it. It's going to be really the last major attack that they have. And after that, Connor, who is in charge of the district, he's going to lead a campaign along with Colonel Samuel Walker. And they're going to push into the Powder River country on a big expedition that's really going to come out with not really a successful campaign. They do attack a village. If I remember right, it's the Battle of Tongue River. My brain's having a fart here for a second. But essentially, they're going to attack one village up there, but the campaign's not really successful in bringing about an end to that war. At one point, one officer does meet with several of William Bent's children that were at Sand Creek the day of the massacre, including Charlie Bent, George Bent, and they basically say, what can we do to bring about an end to this fight? And they say, well, we'll stop fighting when John Shivington's been hung. And as they start to part ways, the Bents say, well, why don't you give us some goods to show that you have good intentions? The commanding officer agrees. They send a private over with the items, and the private hands over the items. Charlie Bent brawls out a revolver and kills that private right there. So it goes to show that Charlie Bent was kind of a hothead. But that 1865 war is going to come to an end without really either side being able to claim total victory, because the Army did not quash what they consider to be the hostiles. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Alliance really didn't get the army out of there. They didn't get what they wanted, which was Shivington Hung. So it just kind of comes to an end. But the military at this point doesn't want to deal with another war because going into economic crisis, don't have the troopers because a lot of them have been sent home or are still being sent home at this point. So in 1866, they try to organize a peace treaty. And during this time, it's worth noting that John Bozeman has tried to open up a trail to the Montana goldfields because there's two ways of getting there. Bozeman's Trail, or you can go by train all the way over to the other side of Wyoming and come up the other side of the mountains the back way in, which takes a lot longer. And then Bridger finds a trail as well that skirts all of the hostile territory, what they consider hostile territory, and goes up through the Wind River and Bighorn River valleys, which is a little more treacherous, has water, but it's not as popular because it takes a little bit longer because it's not as easy to terrain to travel. But the Bozeman Trail is extremely popular. So you basically follow the Oregon Trail up to close to where Casper, Wyoming is now, and then you turn north and follow the eastern face of the Bighorn Mountains. And the eastern face of the Bighorn Mountains, the Powder River Valley, is prime hunting ground for the Native Americans that are in the area. Traditionally, it's Crow territory, but the Lakota are moving in because the buffalo have been pushed into this valley from the east because of all the trading that's taken place back in the 1840s and into the 1850s. And the Lakota do not want the people going through there. They know what happened on the Oregon Trail. The game got run out of the country. They don't want the game run out of this country. They want to preserve their hunting grounds because that is their lifeline. That is their sustenance. Their entire culture depends on buffalo. And so they don't want anything to do with white travelers coming through. And so to kind of bring about a peace and an end to the 1865 conflict, negotiate peaceful travel through the Powder River country, the Army brings them in to have a peace negotiation at Fort Laramie, in which Red Cloud and the Ogalallas do arrive. And so if we want to take a quick break there, because I've been going for 30 minutes.
You're doing good. Okay, I'll hit a few of these comments. Not a lot of questions in here. Serpent Hansa said, I was waiting for this one, wasn't going to miss it. Stephen M. Mann said he's fished in Horse Creek. Oregon Outback wanted to know if that cow there, that Mormon's cow, was the first fast food burger. And Stephen M. Mann said he even still remembers Grattan. But Oregon Outback said a full half a day.
Yeah.
Gray Pilgrim's here. He said, sorry I came in late.
That's fine.
Oregon Outback said, were the early settlers of Denver dyeing their hair pink in those times?
No.
And Gray Pilgrim just said he's in Oregon. He's talking to Oregon Outback, and he says, Duke, write a book.
Working on it.
I'll answer that for you, Gray Pilgrim. He's started. I think he already has your first outline down too, don't you? Basically.
Yeah, the thing is on my laptop. My laptop crashed. I currently do not have a computer because I don't have my laptop, and I'm planning on probably trying to get another one here this year so I can continue to do that. But I'm taking notes.
You got the outline, don't you, and everything? What's it going to be on? I mean, I know.
Actually, I've decided I'm going to start working on a second book as well.
Speaking of Gray Pilgrim's other comment, or 2 books.
Yeah. So the first one I'm working on is a book on the Scouts, and that one's really, that's not going to be an easy one to do because I wanted to talk about all of the Scouts in the West. And the more I think about it, the more it might be a series. But anyway, second one I was doing is I bought this book, and I'm not going to get into too much on it, but it's supposed to be on the Colorado War of 1864 and 65, which is basically this Powder River, the whole thing I just talked about. And I bought a book on it, and the whole book had 20 pages on the actual Colorado War, and the rest of it was about everything from Grattan to Wounded Knee.
Mm-hmm. No,
So
you're
I
right
was a
into
little
that
bit,
a lot.
yeah, I was a little disappointed in it. And so I thought, I should probably sit down and write one. What the heck?
Mhm. I ha-
So
I hate that,
it's in
especially
there.
when you spend 50, $60 on a book that's supposed to be a niche subject, and you get it, and you're like, I got 87 other books that say the exact same thing about everything else, and it just covers everything. That's not what I'm looking for usually.
Right. Yeah, it should have been organized, At first, it was organized pretty good. It talks about the people and such, and I was okay with that. But yeah, there was too much focus on other topics and not enough on the title subject, I felt.
Mhm.
And yeah, I just won't get into it too much. But anyway, it's in the works.
Victor Schultz is in, and he said, USA, hey guys, hey, good to see you. All right, Doug Dukes has Oregon Outback said, how did books get writ before computers?
Pen and
It took
paper. And
a
I've been
long
taking a
time.
lot of notes on pen and paper, yeah. But
Uh,
anymore, you got to write them on a computer.
yeah. Doug Dukes has a good question here, good solid question. He said, when 11th OVC went into Colorado, where were they based out of? I mean, Fort
They
Casper hasn't even been made yet.
they came from Fort Laramie. It was the troops that were garrisoned at Fort Laramie were sent to there. Because Fort Casper was not Fort Casper. Fort Casper got named Fort Casper after Casper Collins is killed. Fort Collins, is Colorado, is named after his father, William O. Collins, who was the commanding officer of Fort Laramie.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, Fort Casper at this point is called Platte River Bridge. It's a little army post. If you've never been there, it's just a small little army post. It's got a settler store. If I remember right, there's one officer's quarters, a couple barracks. It was not a big operation. It was basically there to house a company, maybe two companies, if that. So it was a
So
very
how
small
big was
post.
it? How big was it in 66 then?
66, it still wasn't that big.
Was it Fort Casper then, or was it?
It was named unofficially Fort Casper. Yeah.
Because
I
I was
I
going to
forget when
say,
it actually they actually called it Fort Casper, but for the most part, when I've seen it referred to as Platte River Bridge Station, and the military had stations at this point across. You had Deer Creek Station, you had Platte River Bridge Station, Sweetwater Station. You had all kinds. I can't keep track of all of them, but basically they had the military strung out over the trail,
yeah.
basically to defend it against attack.
Because I saw in one Springfield record that they sent 18 guns to Fort Casper in like August of 66. So I don't know.
Yeah.
The thing is that has been that document's been interpreted into the book. And so you never know if, they're writing that for the modern audience or if the original document said Platte River Bridge.
If I remember right, it wasn't very long after Casper Collins was killed that they did change that. But like I said, most of the stuff that I've read, leading up before, Red Claw's War during the 65, it's called Platte River Bridge Station.
Well, what year did you say he was killed?
He was killed in 65.
Okay,
it was
so yeah, very well could have been then.
I forget, June or July. I think it was July of 1865. Somebody, if you know, fix me on that because sometimes my months get mixed up, my dates get mixed up too. But it was in 1865. I know that it was in the summer of 1865.
Okay. We got Mill Creek Range. I'm sure Duke won't mind if I give him a little shout out here on Duke's channel. He's a pretty good channel, just doing some black powder guns and stuff like that. He said, made it not sure how long flying to Kansas City in the morning for a week. Oh,
fun.
You'll be in my area of the world. By Land and Sea said, I hate it when you have 3 books on the same subject and all 3 contradict each other. That happens a lot.
That's one of the things that's one of the reasons I have so many books and cover the same subject multiple times is forget who it was that told me this, but somebody first told me, he says, if you hear it once, it's rumor, hear it twice, it's fact, and you hear it 3 times, it's gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always, try to double check. And if you read the same thing multiple times, then it helps you get the facts straight. But sometimes you get that where it's 3 different things. They say 3 different things. So basically got to interpret it. And and try to
And
interpret the best you can.
and it's also, and it's some, like, I know that he deals in, like, his favorite thing is like oddity government test firearms, like the Ward Burton and things, that didn't. And so he has a hard time with it. But what's best is to have a period source, a source from like 1920, a source from 1950, 70, and then the sources now. And you can watch the progression and how it changes.
Yeah.
And it's not that those people had any idea what they were saying was wrong. It's just, that's just how it works. There's always new information coming out.
Right. And the access we have to information now is a lot better than it was in the 20s. And but the other problem with that is misinformation is just as easily accessed. But yeah, you got to do your due diligence. The number one thing I check for when I'm reading a book is I check for who published it. If it's one of the bigger presses like University of Nebraska, University of Oklahoma, there's one of them down in Texas. If it's some of the bigger publishing company, Bison Books and them, is probably fairly reputable. Then you look at the author and how much work the author has done. And it's kind of like Paul Hedren. Paul Hedren's probably one of the authorities on all of this. I think you probably do a lot better job of it than I could. But yeah, you got to look into it, and it takes a lot of time to research that stuff. You can't just and nowadays you can go on the internet and find it, but there's minuscule facts that aren't there. For instance, I worked down at Bent's Fort in Colorado for a lot of years, and I never knew how many ties that the Bent family had to Fort Laramie. In 1850, William Bent and Kit Carson bring horses and corn up to Fort Laramie to trade to the settlers coming through. Never knew that. In the later 1850s, Robert Bent, William Bent's son, that's forced to lead the cavalry to the camp at Sand Creek, is driving freight wagons up in this country, probably for his father's trading company. So there's those little minuscule things that you just don't find out there. And then after Sand Creek, in the 1860s, the Army contracts out to have corn delivered to Fort Laramie to give to the Indians for annuities and such, and the shipment, basically isn't being delivered, and they find out, it's John Shivington is the one that's trying to cheat the Indians again. So yeah, there's lots of you can't just read on the internet. If you really want to get in depth, you've got to go to places and you've got to go through records, and you've got to find the stuff that's not there.
And as far as just reading books go, I've learned over the years, automatically look in the back for the source list.
Yep.
And if the source list isn't there, you can't use it. I mean, you can use it for your own personal reading, I guess, but you cannot use it like on YouTube because you've got to have sources. I just had that pamphlet the other day, and I was reading the front of it. This was from the 50s, and the general who wrote it, his sources were like, I got all my sources from non-published manuscripts found in lost outposts. And I was like, how in the world do we trace that down? Then all of his information was wrong. So,
right.
But anyway, yeah, going into that, we got a couple more here before you get back to it. By Land and Sea wrote that, and then Gray Pilgrim said he's a book kind of guy. Chris Klein asked this question: so, what would be the most common civilian scout firearm of this time?
So, as you start getting into the 1860s, the Henry and the Spencer are becoming extremely popular. And in fact, when you read some of the records up that around Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith, a lot of guys are carrying Henrys. A lot of guys are carrying Spencers, if they could afford it. And a Henry's not cheap. It's $80. So that's several months worth of pay. Buy one now. Of course, things ain't much different if you want to get a Henry nowadays. But sharps were common. You're still seeing quite a bit of muzzle loaders out there, but that repeater, that cartridge era, is coming in fast. And so, yeah, at the Fetterman Massacre, which we'll try to get to here before the end of things, there are two men that have Henrys, and there's several others that are noted that had Spencers up at the hayfield fight. So, yeah, those were getting to be very common. Now, folks like old Jim Bridger, of course, they're still carrying their old muzzle loaders and stuff. But yeah, the younger guys, the second generation of scouts that's starting to appear at this time period, they're all transitioning into those repeaters.
Now, the government in the 1870s did have a system, a procurement plan in place for scouts arms. I know they did definitely the Native Scouts.
Yeah.
Did they have that in the 1850s?
Not that I've read too much up on, but I know during the later 1860s, Forsyth Scouts for Beecher Island, those men were all hired as civilian scouts, but they were then supplied with arms and equipment by the government. Basically, they were run as a militia unit at that point, but they were all issued Spencer carbines, and they were all issued Blakesley boxes.
Yep. Okay, just two more comments here. Stephen and Man said, a lost outpost and no one seen before, finding long overdue library books, not fishy at all. And right. Landon C said, because of inconsistencies I'm finding, I'm going through volumes of Naval Heritage primary microfilm scans for ships, logs, and unit diaries. Yep. At least you can tell us where they're at. You don't have to tell us it's in a long lost outpost. But anyway, you ready to go again?
Yeah, I'll just add on that, when you're doing your research, primary sources are always great, especially if they're being written as it happens, so diaries and journals. Primary sources are written after the fact, then you have to start taking with a grain of salt because memory isn't as good, and the most common thing you see wrong is number of people, the year that something took place. Like William Hamilton's book is a great example. He's got 6-shot revolvers in the 1840s. Well, it would have been the Pattersons at that point that they're using, which were a 5-shot. But yeah, small things like that. So yeah, it's just there's a whole when you go to college for history, there's a whole class on how to do all that stuff. But yeah, it's just one of those things you gotta pour into things if you really, really want to get the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I left off with they're starting to have the Treaty of 1866 at Fort Laramie. And so for this treaty, they've brought in Red Cloud, and at this point, Red Cloud is open to talks, but very adamant that they're not going to, negotiate. They do not want the Bozeman Trail open. In fact, they want it closed. And at this point, the Bozeman Trail is active, but the natives want it shut down. The government wants to open it, and the government wants to establish forts along it for the protection, as they claim, for the natives and the immigrants. And while this negotiation is going on, the Army has already given orders for Colonel Carrington, to march to Fort Laramie with his troops and to head up the Bozeman Trail and to establish military forts along the Bozeman. There's going to be 3 forts. There's already one that was established that Patrick Carter had established the year before, 1865, that he called it Camp Connor, and it's going to get renamed to Fort Reno. The next one he's going to establish will be named Fort Phil Kearny, after Phil Kearny, who was a nephew of Stephen Watts Kearny, and that's what Fort Kearny, Nebraska, is named after, Stephen Watts. Fort Phil Kearny is named after Phil Kearny, of course. And then the third one will be Fort C.F. Smith, that gets established in Montana up along the Yellowstone. And Carrington, he's been in the military for a while, and during the Civil War, he does not get experience fighting because he gets put in charge of the 18th Infantry, and then they put him on recruitment duty. And Carrington was an excellent administrator, but he never got combat experience. But he's going to be sent out to the West, and I forget how many, but there's 3 divisions of the 18th Infantry. He's got multiple companies out of each division, and they're going to be sent up into up into the Powder River country along the Bozeman Trail. And as he starts to approach Fort Laramie, he realizes that there's peace negotiations going on at that point. And he realizes that his arrival it could cause issues with the peace negotiations. And so he tries to stall as long as he can. He writes to his commanders and basically states that, there's this peace negotiation going on. Can I stall until the negotiations are finalized before I go up? And they basically told him, get to marching, get moving. You need to get up there. You got to be up there and have these forts established before the winter. And so this is in 1866, of course. And so he marches into Fort Laramie in the middle of the peace negotiations. And as I said, Red Cloud had been open to having a discussion. Like I said, he's not going to back down, but he's open to talking with people. He's, in good faith and whatnot. And when Carrington's troops arrive, Red Cloud becomes infuriated. And he basically gets up in front of the peace commissioners and he states that before you have even bought the land that you want and paid me for it, you're already sending the troops to steal it. I am not going to talk with you any longer. Now I'm going to fight, and I will make the Bozeman Trail run red with blood. And he leaves. And according to Carrington, at one point, Red Cloud walks past him, and Carrington's in fear that, Red Cloud's going to try to kill him because Red Cloud knows that he's been sent there to take the land. And so the army kind of gets in a fit and tells several of the native leaders, well, if he's not going to negotiate, you need to elect new chiefs so we can push this peace treaty through. And the natives that want to maintain peace basically send their chiefs to him. And those chiefs are going to sign this peace treaty, and they're going to be given annuity goods. And so as Carrington starts his way up, he's going to arrive at Fort Reno, and that's when things are going to start to happen. The natives start to run off livestock. There was a rancher nearby that had his livestock stolen. Some of the military livestock is stolen. And in the process of trying to recover horses, they recover a horse. The horse is packed down with the annuity goods that they received at Fort Laramie. So basically what happened is that particular group of Lakota either changed their mind or were forced by the other Lakotas to join them, but they basically gave the annuities back, said, we're going to fight. So Carrington's already off to a bad start. He's going to head from Fort Reno. The initial idea was Fort Reno would be his main headquarters, but then he moves up to see the establishment of what will become Fort Phil Kearny. They're going to arrive just outside of what's now Story, Wyoming, which is pretty close to Buffalo, Wyoming. And he finds a little plain not too far from Pinot Creek that has a nice open flat area. In fact, it's right on the creek. Nice open flat area. It's about 4 miles from the Bighorn Mountains. So basically it's a little flat and then it goes up into the Bighorns. And so he decides that this is where he's going to establish his military base. And Carrington orders construction immediately. But he's not going to focus on construction of buildings. He starts with construction of a palisade because he realizes at this point he's not going to get this country without a fight. And he starts writing letters to his commanding officers and says, everything I've seen thus far states that the natives are not friendly. These natives have not agreed to the peace treaty that you told me they had agreed to. And, I need, 1, reinforcements, and 2, I need better arms, and 3, I need more ammunition. Because he was sent up with a very small amount of ammunition at this point, and mostly they still have muzzle-loading Springfield rifles.
I have to quote Gummer from Tremors 3 at this point. I feel I have been denied vital, need to know
information. So Carrington begins, construction of the palisade. They're going to establish, a sawmill, basically the pinery, about 4 miles away, which is going to be the site of the Wagon Butts fight the following year. establishes pinery, and they start bringing, logs down, and they begin construction of the palisade walls. And the logs are cut to where they basically fit up close. So they're split down the sides, left round on the rest of it. They're split down the sides, so they sit very tight together. And at first, the palisade wall doesn't hold up very well. Then Carrington tells them, we need to beef this up. And so they do. They cut the palisade walls. They cut ports, basically rifle ports that are actually higher than a man's head, put platforms in so that as a man stands up, he fires his gun, he can step back down to reload and doesn't risk being shot. And so Carrington's design is actually a very well-designed palisade. They're going to continue on the construction of the palisade, but as they start getting into closer to wintertime, there's still no quarters built other than several officers' quarters. The men are still living in tents at this point. Supplies are being stored under tarps and tents, and the military brass essentially is going to send in an officer to inspect it, and the officer is going to basically, chastise Carrington because Carrington's, focusing on building his palisade and not buildings for his troops or his storage. And as they start moving into December or into the winter time, then Carrington starts to, do the construction of the buildings. Some of Carrington's officers that he has with him is a Captain Tenike, as well as George Washington Grummond, who comes in a little bit later after the palisade starts to be constructed. But pretty much almost immediately from the construction point, the natives start attacking the woodcutting details. Basically not big skirmishes, but harassment.
And what year is this?
This is in 1866. Okay, I think I said 65 earlier. I screwed up. It's 66.
No. I'm still trying in my mind to place where those 18 rimfire trapdoor rifles went. So yeah, 1866 would be a good year.
Right. So 1866, yeah, they're doing the construction. The natives are doing their harassment essentially, but Red Cloud and them are realizing that they need to kind of change their tactics because the natives before that have what's called the fighting season. Basically, they fight during the summer. The wintertime is spent basically trying to survive. They don't really do much fighting in the wintertime. That's when everybody disperses out. So they don't use up all the resources in an area and basically try to survive through the winter. And Red Cloud decides he's going to fight into the winter. And so the attacks keep coming on. At one point in early December of 1866, the woodcutting detail is going to be attacked. And at this point, Crazy Horse decides he wants to try a tactic to see, how foolish these soldiers are going to be. And so they attack the woodcutting detail and they send out troops to relieve them. And Carrington at this point had realized that the infantry takes too long essentially to get to where they're going. And so he starts training his infantry units to ride on horseback, so mounted infantry, so that they can respond more quickly to these attacks. And he has a company of the 2nd Cavalry. Now, he was supposed to get several more companies. Only one company shows up, Company C of the 2nd Cavalry. And at one point, like I said, as Crazy Horse decides he's going to start trying to see if he can decoy the soldiers, they attack the woodcutting detail, and Crazy Horse sets up his little decoy, and the troopers take it. And that kind of is going to set the stage for what's going to come up here towards later in December, just a few weeks away. But during this decoy, Captain Tenike and Lieutenant Grummond go to pursue the hostiles. Carrington comes in with a relief column because he could see what's kind of going on from the fort. Tenike goes over one part of the hill, Grummond goes around another part of the hill, and Grummond gets surrounded. And Grummond nearly comes close to being wiped out at this point. However, Carrington manages to arrive and basically save his tail. But Drummond and Ten Eyck, right there in front of the troops and everybody, start chastising Carrington, their superior officer, saying that he should have been out there faster. He should have followed them directly instead of coming in the other direction. And, they would have taken out that group of natives. And of course, at this point, the natives kind of scatter out, which was their typical, hit and run guerrilla tactics. And so that's kind of the sets the mood that the junior officers had no respect for Carrington. They, at this point, were getting to the point of not following his orders. Captain Fetterman arrives, and Fetterman and Carrington had been fairly close, and Fetterman, was friendly towards Carrington. But after talking with the others, and he realizes, Carrington is not what you would call a fighting officer. Like I said, during the Civil War, he didn't get much fighting experience. He didn't get any at all. He was on administrative duties. Carrington was a great administrator. And so Carrington starts getting backlash from his junior officers. And so to kind of move things along here, a few weeks later, Red Cloud and Crazy Horse are going to once again attack the woodcutting detail. And at this point, they've got the big attack planned. And so leading up to this, their camp was not actually that far away from Fort Phil Kearny. And one of the things that Carrington had been ordered to do was to start doing offensive operations. However, he'd had enough horses stolen from raids from the natives. Mm-hmm. He didn't have the manpower, and he didn't have the armaments to conduct an offensive operation. And so the military is not happy with him because he's just running strictly defensive operations, with the exception of when he goes out to relieve attacks on woodcutting details. And so the natives are camped close by. And at one point, a Cheyenne, I guess you could say he was kind of a holy man, basically comes and he does a little ceremony. And this is where they get the name the Battle of 100 in the Hand, because the Cheyenne man goes out, does his chants, comes back, he says, I've got 20. Red Cloud says that's not enough. He comes back, he says, I got 50. Red Cloud says it's not enough. Comes back and he says, I've got 100. And they all whoop and say, all right, great. This is going to be, that'll be what we're going to go for. Comes pretty close to being 100 in the hand. It's actually about 80 some that get killed. But anyway, they see that as a good sign. And so they start their attack. They're going to, and I forget my date. I think it was Christmas Eve. No, excuse me. It was December. Gotta get my book. Like I said, my dates get screwed up here, but yeah.
Well,
go ahead and read
you do all you do off your head anyway.
Yeah, that's why I said dates are not good with me. I know it was December 20 something. Go ahead and read through the chat there while I'm.
Okay, we don't have much here. Gotsloco said books were written by hand and by typewriters. Still has an Olympia standard. I can bring it up here.
So December.
Ever want to use it again? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. December 6th was the first big one where the Crazy Horse kind of puts his action into play. Basically the test action. And then it's going to be December 20. Out of hell with it. It was just before Christmas. The woodcutting detail is going to come under attack, and Carrington orders the troops mustered. And Captain Fetterman at this point decides he wants to lead this battalion or this group. And Fetterman was a fighting man. He had fought in 18th Infantry during the Civil War. And so he wants to lead it out. He thinks he can get the job done. And so Carrington tells him, go out, relieve the woodcutting detail. Under no circumstances do you cross Lodgepole Ridge. And so Fetterman leaves the fort. Carrington decides he's going to send Lieutenant Grummond with the cavalry in support. And he tells Grummond, under no circumstance do you cross Lodgepole Ridge. Go out, relieve the woodcutting detail, and return to the fort. Do not cross the ridge. He tells him 3 times. And the third time he says, he calls him back. He's already leaving the fort. He calls him back. Carrington's standing on the palisade and he tells Grummond, do not cross the ridge.
I got one question here.
Yeah.
We talk about this a lot. How in the world does Carrington know, or what is scaring him about that ridge? Just the unknown of the other side, or what's going on?
Yeah. So basically, where Fort Phil Kearny is set, it's set kind of down in a little valley. Mm-hmm. You have Lodge Trail Ridge on the north, and I forget what the name of the ridge of the trail is to the south, but you can see up the top of the ridge is, and I was up there and it was kind of hazy that day because there was smoke, so I can't, if I remember right, it was within the top of the ridge, was within cannon shot of the larger guns.
Okay.
If you cross the ridge, there's no support because this ridge just runs right in front of the fort there. And so, yeah, Carrington's, and he watches the whole thing. The cavalry goes out. He can see where the woodcutting detail is, and he watches, and pretty soon he sees the troopers heading up over the ridge. So what had happened is Crazy Horse had set up decoys once again, and supposedly Crazy Horse gets off of his animal, his horse, and legend has it drops his breech clout, basically moons the troops to entice them to chase him. He wants them to chase him up, chase his group up over the ridge. And we don't know really what happens, what causes them to cross. So it's a question of, did Fetterman disobey orders and lead his troops over the ridge, or did Grummond, who had disobeyed orders several times, Grummond had been very vocal against Carrington, did Lieutenant Grummond, being a typical lieutenant at that time trying to find glory, decide to cross the ridge, and Fetterman follows him, trying to, basically support him? What we know for sure is that the whole unit is going to cross the ridge, and they start to hear gunfire. And slow at first, and it starts to pick up. As the gunfire picks up, Carrington orders Captain Tenike to make a third column to go up and support, and basically tell Fetterman to get his butt back to the fort. And so Tenike starts to organize his troops. The firing gets increasingly more rapid, and then suddenly it starts dwindling down as Tenike is making his way up to the ridge. And where the ridge is at, Fetterman and them march through a notch. And so if you've never been to the site, there's a notch there, and basically you cross the ridge, and then there's a little finger ridge that comes down the other side of that notch, and it has all kinds of little finger ravines. And what happens is that as Fetterman and Grummond cross over, they're going to head down the middle of that finger ridge. And from the east, the Lakota are going to attack. From the west, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho are going to attack, and they're basically going to come up this ridge and attack them from both sides. Typically, when you have the high ground, that means, you have the upper hand on things. But in this circumstance, there's not enough men, there's not enough cover to really put up a good defense. The cavalry gets the farthest down, of course, and they start to be attacked. They start to fall back. The natives are going to take them out fairly quickly. The infantry had gotten up into a pile of rocks further up the ridge. And that's the group that's going to put up the longest fight. And so the natives go through, and at this point, the natives don't have much for firearms. They still mostly have muzzleloaders, what natives have guns. And the rest is bow and arrows, clubs, tomahawks, hand-to-hand weapons. But that overwhelming force, and the fact that the troopers are using muzzleloaders, this infantry unit is using muzzleloaders, they're pretty quickly overwhelmed. 2 civilians went with this detachment, and those 2 civilians each have Henry rifles. And so where they were hiding out at in the rocks there, they put up the largest fight. And the natives that were at the fight later on described that the 2 men with the repeating rifles actually were the last 2 to be killed. They find over 100 cartridge cases where these 2 men were at. And in a circle around them, they find dozens of pools of blood. So basically, dozens of spots where they were able to shoot and wound, the native attackers. So as Tin Ike comes up the ridge, he gets there just in time to see the mutilation part of the fight in progress. And in the native beliefs, the reason why they're mutilating his bodies is because they believe in an afterlife. And so if you mutilate the body, that person in the afterlife cannot cause you problems. So if you cut them on the legs, they can't run. If you cut the arms, they can't use their arms. If you poke out their eyes, they can't see. If you cut out the tongue, they can't talk. And so they pretty well brutally mutilate the troopers that are there. In fact, there's not really any bodies except for one. One body is left unmutilated, and that is the bugler Adolf Metzger. And he was left unmutilated. He was covered in a buffalo robe. Basically, he fought very bravely, very gallantly, and so they left him alone out of a sign of respect, because he basically was fighting hand to hand with his bugle and cracking natives on the skull with it. And later on, supposedly they did find in the 1900s a bugle at that site that was mashed down to a pulp. So he's the only one left unmutilated. But Tin Ike gets up there and he calls for reinforcements and says, bring up an artillery piece. Because the natives, they realize the artillery piece, its power. And so, usually when an artillery piece is brought into the fight, they tend to back off. But he calls for the artillery piece. He sits up on top of the ridge. The natives are satisfied, essentially, at this point with the number they've killed, and they start to dwindle away. And at that point, then they call up the wagons to recover the bodies. And this is in December. There's a blizzard on the way in. The temperature is dropping. And so rigor mortis is setting in pretty quick. And the bodies are so heavily mutilated that, they basically are putting body parts with other parts of bodies. So they don't know if they're putting it with the right person or not. But they find Lieutenant Fetterman. Fetterman's head had been caved in, and supposedly, it was a American horse that kills Fetterman at that fight. Grumman's body they cannot find, and there's several other bodies that are still missing. They load up what they can. They start back, and things are so south at this point as they're going back. One of the wagons tips over, and so these troopers have to load all of the bodies back into the wagon again. They're brought back to the fort, and then they start, trying to do the burial procedures. Ground is frozen at this point, so they lay out coffins, and if I remember right, it was something to the effect of 2 to 3 and up to 4 people per coffin. And when they go to bury them, instead of individual graves, they just dig one giant trench to throw them in. And the temperature at this point is so low that troopers dig for about 15 minutes, and then they're set in to warm up, and then the next trooper comes in to pick up on that digging detail. But this attack pretty much has rattled everybody at the fort. And so Carrington, basically, he goes into the armory at this point. He goes to the artillery shells, and he punches all the Borman fuses. They gather up all the munitions in there, and he gives the order that should the fort come under attack, all the women and children are to be sent to the armory. And in the event that there's no chance of survival, the armory is to be set on fire to prevent the women and children being attacked. So basically he's saying, blow up our own to prevent them from being, mutilated. And so Carrington is pretty desperate at this point. He starts writing letters, and he decides that he needs to send a telegram to Fort Laramie and to his superiors back east, telling of the fight. And Portuguese Phillips, who's a civilian, he was a miner that was actually working for the fort there. He steps forward, and then one of his buddies steps forward to also carry the dispatches. Phillips is given the order to ride to Fort Laramie. His friend is just given the order to go to Fort Reno. Well, they're going to ride to Fort Reno together. And Phillips picks one of Carrington's personal horses to ride out because there's not a lot of horses left. And those that are left aren't in really great condition at this point. And so a blizzard is on its way in. And so Phillips begins the ride with his partner. They arrive at Fort Reno. There's a telegraph station there. And they send out a telegraph, but the telegraph operator says there hasn't been any messages all day. He can't guarantee that the line's up. And so Phillips probably changes horses at this point. We're not quite sure. Fairly sure he does change it one time. But from there, he's going to ride to Deer Creek Station, where there's a telegraph again. He has it telegraphed one more time and maybe change his horses at Deer Creek Station. Then he's going to ride in to Fort Laramie. The blizzard, at this point is in full swing. And he's going to arrive late at night on December 24th to Fort Laramie. And at this point, the officers are having their little ball in Old Bedlam, which is the commanding officer's quarters at the time. And he steps in, and the people that are there kind of wondering what's going on, because here's this rough-looking civilian showing up to their fancy party, and Phillips tells them what's happened. And the interesting thing is that the officers had an idea that the massacre had taken place because the Native Americans that are living at Fort Laramie, what they call the Laramie Loafers, have already been talking about the Fetterman fight. So there's the old joke from the Vietnam days about the jungle telegram is the fastest form of communication. Essentially, it's the same thing here. The natives at Fort Laramie know about it before really officers get official word. Mm-hmm. But there's the myth that Phillips arrives about half dead and his horse dies on the parade ground. Well, that didn't exactly happen that way. The horse does die 2 days later, basically he was just rode to death.
Broke his hand.
Yeah.
You can do that. I tell people all the time, you ride a horse like that in the cold, it don't take very long.
Yeah, and it's several hundred miles ride, and he did it in just a few days. But after the massacre, the Army kind of starts pointing fingers at this point. And Carrington is going to take all of the blame. And so Carrington's going to get reassignment. Basically, he's going to be sent to another post, still in Wyoming, but outside the Powder River Valley. I cannot remember exactly which one it was, but he gets reassigned, and they're going to pull him back. And at this point, the Army realizes that this isn't going to be peaceful. The natives aren't honoring the the Treaty of 1866, which Red Cloud didn't really sign anyway, and they realize they're going to have to fight for the Powder River country. And so the Fetterman Massacre, for the native perspective, is going to be the only real major attack that they come out completely victorious on. After that, it's going to be smaller skirmishes, basically just little hit and run attacks on wagon trains, attacks on small Army detachments, attacks on the woodcutting details. But it's going to continue on through, early 1867 until you get to August of 1867, in which case you're going to have a dual attack. And essentially it's going to be the Oglalas are going to attack the woodcutting detail down at Fort Phil Kearny, and a smaller group of Lakota and majority Cheyenne and Arapaho are going to attack up at Fort C.F. Smith, and they'll be known as the Hayfield and the Wagon Box fights.
August 1st and 2nd.
August 1st and 2nd. And
That's
I need
what
another water break.
Woo, guys. I got a lot of comments going on over here, but guys, I got to say, that's probably the fourth time I've heard Duke tell that exact same story in the exact same way, but every single time I get on the edge of my seat and wonder, because you always tweak it just a little bit. And what I
Right.
just got out of it this time as I was sitting here listening is you go on YouTube Shorts today, and if you just scroll through there, you'll soon, especially if you're a history lover, you will find some blue-haired person on there talking about, well, if we were around back then, we would have never done this to the natives. And then you'll find a native on there that says, we never did this to the whites. And it's always back and forth. People have no concept of just how brutal that world was that they were living in. Imagine you're a native living on the other side of the ridge with a never-ending nightmare that this thing that keeps on coming, these Europeans are never going to stop. And then on the other hand, be the 20 or 30 guys that are by themselves, at Fort Laramie during the Grattan Massacre, being like, we're not going to make it through this. And very quickly, you can see how racial tensions would build, let's say,
Right.
for a long time, not to get political. But yeah, people just have no clue today. Their bodies are still probably not in the right grave. I mean,
no, and
together.
And it was hard to identify bodies. In fact, they lined the bodies up basically in the parade ground and had friends of those men try to identify who they could.
Mm-hmm.
But the mutilations were so bad that it's anybody's guess as to who was in what coffin. And the reality of it is that there's no coffin that's probably got a complete body in it. Because and it's a direct quote from one of the men that was there, is that one man got the entrails of another, one man would have the legs of two men. Very few wound up with all the parts of that belonged to them.
Yep. And yeah, it's just, I was just going to say, the hardest thing to do now studying history for anybody on any side of the spectrum, politically or whatnot today, is to take your bias and your experience and everything and your thoughts and set it aside and not look at history through the lens of presence. To look at history through you got to look at through the eyes of the people you're studying. And that obviously means you can't just study one side. You have to study to get a full picture of what's happening.
Right.
But anyway, I'll get in here into the comments. By Land and Sea said, I'm on the edge of my seat listening to Duke tell this story. And Louisiana Gray said, yeah, it's been pretty interesting, hasn't it? By Land and Sea said, Louisiana Gray reminds me of listening to Charlton Heston narrating a story. Same delivery method. Has my total attention. Guys, that's why he does what he does for a living. Go up there and see him give us talk someday up there in Wyoming.
Right. But yeah, go ahead.
And Louisiana Gray said, that's why I never try to miss an episode. Gray Pilgrim said, Duke should write that as a book. Louisiana Gray said, totally agree with Land and Sea. Gray Pilgrim said, we should hear more of this guy. And he said, by the way, his Johnny Reb or Billy Yank and Johnny Reb videos are absolute hoot. Haven't seen any of those for a while.
Yeah, and I went off and left my Johnny Reb cap back at home, so I need to get a hold of my uncle and have him put that in the box he's going to be sending me. But yeah.
Yep. Gray Pilgrim says Garrett 100%, and By Land and Sea said exactly. Louisiana Gray said it was a harsh world back then, but worse before. Never got any better. And that's all we got for now.
Okay, here we go. So Carrington is sent to Fort Casper.
For a second.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Carrington, after he's relieved of command at Fort Phil Kearny, he's reassigned to Fort Casper. And so, yeah, that's where he's sent down to. Let's see here. And then, yeah, Brevet Major General Christopher Agur is going to replace Cook as the commander of the district. And excuse me, as the Department of the Platte. That would be the district. Yeah. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of things that are taking place at this point here. But also kind of set the stage of one bad thing after another is that after this attack, to add to the demoralizing of the men, is that the weather is going to take a turn for the worse. And so, if you're not familiar with this part of the country, wintertime is not a very nice time to be up in this part of the country up here. So the cold's going to set in. Like I said, Portuguese Phillips rides through a blizzard. The temperature is going to drop down into the negative 20s at Fort Phil Kearny. And the men are going to start suffering from exposure in the wintertime. In fact, on guard mount, men are only out for, like 30 minutes at the most before they're replaced. And so conditions up there are just plain miserable. Take into account, too, that the food rations are not that great. They're low on ammunition. They really can't go out and hunt because Carrington had pretty much told them not to go out and hunt anymore because whatever soldier was sent out to hunt, they often did not come back because the natives were encircled around Fort Phil Kearny pretty much all the time. But Red Cloud's band is pretty well satisfied at this point with their victory, and with the cold weather coming in, they're going to disperse out, and so they're going to go into their winter camps up along the Tongue and the Powder Rivers for what's going to be the rest of the winter. And so the fighting really at this point is going to take basically a downgrade. It's not going to be much going on for a while. But as they get into, start getting into the summer of 1867, like I said, those attacks on wagon train.
We lost him. We lost you, Duke. Can you hear me? At least I did.
All right. Still there?
Second. Yeah, you froze for a minute. Let me take you out and put you back in. Okay, you there? Yeah, you're moving now. Okay.
I don't know what happened there.
Last thing you said was wagon train.
So they're going to start, they'll be attacking wagon trains, and most of the attacks, like I said, are going to be small scale. The Fetterman fight is going to be, the largest engagement and the largest victory for the natives at this point. But yeah, so that's basically, that's volume 1, Red Cloud's War.
Yeah, very good.
And so, so the next one we'll be getting into, of course, will be volume 2. And so kind of what is, and hopefully I'll get this read here in the next coming weeks, but basically what it gets into is it starts talking about the springtime, and we'll get into the springtime court of inquiry. The government at this point doesn't want to continue fighting because this is becoming a very expensive operation to keep these forts going and to fight this conflict. And so they're going to try to start peace efforts. The command's going to take change, and then you start getting into the hayfield fight and the wagon box fight, and then eventually it'll be wind up ending with the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 and the closing of the Bozeman Trail.
So we got a part 2 coming, huh?
So we got a part 2 coming. So so the original plan had been we was going to do the horse meat march, and then the next 2 episodes were going to be on Santa Fe Trail and Tom Tobin, but we're going to push those back. The big reason is I'm still in the process of moving in, and things have been real busy, and so my books on the Santa Fe Trail and stuff are all buried, and I haven't had time to dig them out yet. And what it comes down to is last weekend, I was helping my good friend move. She's moving to Iowa, took a job as museum. I don't think she's a curator, but she's basically going to be in charge of the museum at Rock Island Arsenal. And so, I was helping her. I was busy with that, so I just didn't have a lot of time to get ready like I thought I would. But being that I was reading this for work, I thought, we'd go ahead and get an in-depth into Red Cloud's War. But we will get into those other 3, the Horse Meat March, Santa Fe Trail and Tom Tobin later on here in the series. And for right now, I think we're still good for being on Saturday 2 weeks from now. I may start working on weekends, but I'll have an early shift if that happens. And so the scheduling is going to probably change, and probably going to have to change to a weekday once we get past Memorial Day and start getting into that, because my work schedule right now, it's up in the air what happens. Right now I'm on weekends off, but coming up, we don't know what's going to play out.
Mm-hmm. Guards of Vlogs is in, said, sorry I'm late. What did I miss? Well, you missed a peace treaty, a massacre, and a dead cow.
Yeah.
And a war.
Nice thing is, you can always go back and watch it.
Yep. I'll go through a few more of these comments here, guys. Let's see. AR American says, Duke has forgotten more history than I ever learned. Stephen M. Mann said, yep, only 3 seasons in the Rockies, July, August, and winter.
Right.
Yeah, nap time. That was whenever you disappeared, and Serpent Hanso said, Marco. And let's see here. William Slossler set, sorry. 9 months of winter, 3 more of fall, a whisper of springtime, or no summer at all. Yeah, he said, I couldn't handle that, William. We have plenty of summer down here in Louisiana. Garza, yeah, you missed the good part, but you can always go back and watch it. And this is only part 1 of a part 2 series.
Yep.
So we got it. I don't know if I'll be done with what I'm doing in June at the time, but man, we got to do an anniversary of Little Bighorn on the 25th or in that vicinity, right, whenever that day is you have off. And I can't wait to hear you tell that story again. That's one of my favorites.
Thing of it is, I may be up at Little Bighorn on that weekend.
Get you a hotel with good Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So a friend of mine, he used to work. He worked here the first year I did, and then he's now over at Scottsbluff. So he's not very far away, but he's been pushing me hard to go up to Little Bighorn this year with him. And so if we can make that work on that weekend, I think we're going to try to make that play out.
Reenacting or just visiting? Just
visiting. There's always something big going on that day up there, and so that's kind of why I'm kind of thinking maybe trying to make that work, but it's all going to be scheduled to dependent, of course. But yeah, I may be able to pull that off. Like I said, I got to get a hold of my friend of mine and see what he thinks on it. And I don't have my calendar, but what day is the 25th?
Let me look. That is a Sunday.
Sunday, okay, yeah. I wouldn't have that day off anyway. But it might get close to it. But we'll try to make something work. I'm going to be working the late night shifts probably most of the summer. So we're going to probably have to do these chats on my day off, but we'll do something close to the Little Bighorn, maybe the few days before or a few days after.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll make that a special episode, not count it towards a regular Tales of the Trails, but do that as like a special episode.
Yeah, because that's a really special story, and I want to hear it again.
Right.
I want to hear you live from Little Bighorn. Tell the story of Little Bighorn.
Yeah, we might make that work. But so anyway, one thing I wanted to start doing is kind of start providing books on the subjects that we're talking about. And so like I've already mentioned that the 2 books here on Red Cloud's War, these are by McDermott. They are currently in print, so if you find them, they're going to be expensive, but it's a 2-volume set on Red Cloud's War. And the first volume is what we just talked about, leads up to Fetterman Massacre, and shortly what happens after that. And then there's the D. Brown book, the Fetterman Massacre. It was first called Fort Phil, Kearny, an American Saga, and I think now they have gone back to that title. because Fetterman Massacre, they don't like using massacres for describing military conflicts where the military got whooped. They call them fights now. But this one is a pretty good source that focuses heavily on the Fetterman Massacre. There are the books by the Mrs. Carringtons. So there's can't remember which one of which, but there's Absaroka, and it's actually spelled Absaraka. And give me a quick second. I'm going to see if I can dig those books out. I think they're.
Okay.
I've got them out. I may not. I may have to dig a little bit. Let me see if I can find them. I got one box here.
We can put them in the description too.
Right.
From now on, just let me know ahead of time when I'm making the
Yeah,
the post. And
I didn't think of that until
I'll put a reading list in the description.
I got going, but so kind of the book on the 1865 war, Circle of Fire. So this is what leads up to Red Cloud's War. Great book, highly recommend it. This one is also by McDermott, John McDermott, and McDermott his books are very easy to read. Let's see here. I've got also. And then for the Grattan Massacre, which one's this one? That's 40 pounds of damn beans a day. Okay, so for the Grattan Massacre, all because of a Mormon cow. This was actually one of the authors on here, Sandra Day Lowry, and also John McDermott. Sandra Day Lowry used to be the librarian at Fort Laramie until she passed away. So that's a really good book. It's a small part of it is a narrative, and then the rest of it is all letters. And then if I remember right, let's see here. So their book. Oh, I love it when they give these chapters names that don't really tell what's going on with it. But anyway, another great book, Scalp Dance, Thomas Goodrich. That's basically on all the Indian Wars from 1865 to 79. So that's kind of a condensed version. Let me see if I can dig those other ones out.
Okay. I'll go through a few comments here.
If I don't trip, knock the phone down.
Stephen M. Mann says, anniversary of Little Bighorn at the battlefield. That'd be cool. Louisiana Gray said, cool, William. Did you find our summer rough? Morgan Outback said, we could have a greasy grass pie. And By Land and Sea has a question here. I'll wait till Duke gets back, guys. We got through that in a little over an hour and a half. I appreciate all of you guys coming out. Excuse me. He is going to be back here in just a minute with those books, so...
I'm just on the other side of the phone.
Oh, he can still hear me.
Yeah.
So, By Land and Sea wants to know, does the U.S. Cavalry still reenact the battle at Greasy Grass?
Not on site.
Cavalry. Sorry, I said
the Park Service does not allow reenactments on site.
I can understand that. To an extent, it seems almost a little bit disrespectful to have it actually on the site, but yeah.
Yeah, there's no reenactments that display the action of soldiers dying, basically.
I see. Well, that's just about every reenactment in history.
Okay.
So anyway, how you coming along?
Found the ones I was looking for because I don't have the other one. All right. So the other two books, just on the Bozeman, the Bloody Bozeman. I haven't actually got too far into this one yet. This one's more on the Bozeman Trail that was going on. So just kind of going through on the chapters. It goes into 1863, kind of when the Bozeman Trail is getting started. So it talks about the Yellowstone expedition. Let's see. Stuart Party. Yeah, basically kind of leads up to that. 1864 talks about Bridger and his trails and such. 1865, yeah, it goes over. It basically breaks it down into each year, and then yeah, then it gets into yeah, in 1866 over what we just went over here. 1867 wagon box fight, hayfield fight, harsh life of a soldier. 1868, talks about the Red Cloud basically wins the war. And then yeah, it gets into a little bit in 1868, kind of at the end there. After 1868, and then for first-hand account. So one thing it's a little extra added is that Carrington is going to have two wives that both wound up at Fort Phil Kearny. His first wife, Margaret Carrington, is going to write the book Absaroka, or Absaraka as she titles it, Home of the Crows, basically her journal. So retells Red Cloud's War. And I've been reading on this one. I need to, things I got to dig out, I can read some more. But basically talks about their travel on their way there, because they did go through Fort Sedgwick or Camp Rankin. And so I'd gotten as far as I'm getting to Fort Laramie or close to Fort Laramie. But yeah, she talks about everything. No, take that back. She just got to Mud Springs. I'm 2 chapters from Fort Laramie. But this is kind of a great book. Great firsthand account. And then, so as I said, Carrington has 2 wives over there. So Margaret Carrington's going to die after the fact. And Carrington will wind up marrying Lieutenant Grumman's wife, Frances Grumman. And so she'll become Frances Grumman Carrington. And she writes a book, and the title just left my head. I can't even remember the title of it now. Somebody out there knows the one I'm talking about. Chime in. It's like done had a brain fart because I don't have that book, but I think it's My Army Life and the Fort Phil Kearny saga. Yeah, that's what it is. My Army Life. But she writes a book on it. Another great source. But yeah, all these books are excellent sources. Of course, there's the book on the wagon box fight that's written by Jerry Keenan. This is all about a little one day. It's a smaller book. And then there's not currently a book on the hayfield fight, but there is a paper. So if you have access to JSTOR, that's where I found it. But it's a small paper, basically a magazine article that gets into the hayfield fight. But we'll be getting into that, of course, on the next episode.
So is that officially where the first 66 was used in the hayfield fight or the wagon box fight?
Hayfield was on August 1st. Wagon box was August 2nd.
Yeah. But were those the same group of soldiers, technically?
One was at Fort C.F. Smith. The other was at Fort Phil Kearny. But they were all supplied with the Allen conversions.
Gotcha. So that's what I always think when we always talk about the wagon box fight being the first time the Allen conversion saw combat. I always have to stop and think, wait a minute, there's another one before that.
Right. And it's worth noting that in 1866, Carrington knew of the existence of the breech loaders because Carrington, in a letter, writes the military and says, "My arms are not sufficient for this type of combat, and I need breech loading weapons, breech loading muskets." And he's going to, he's in November, he is going to receive Spencer rifles and carbines that arrive with the musicians. And so he's going to take them away from the musicians and give them to the fighting men. So as I remember, the cavalry had the Spencers, the infantry still had the muskets. Mm-hmm. And so there was a group that did have repeating arms, but they were so overwhelmed that it didn't do very, very good because, like I said, there was only 80 men there and only about half of them had Spencers.
Yep. Okay, one more comment here. I'm not going to read that. I'm going to let you read that. Just see what your reaction is.
So I heard Custer and Saddam Hussein said the same thing on the battlefield. Or all these. Ah!
Josiah
Wow.
Jones.
That was well played.
Oh, so I think we're there, aren't we?
Yeah, well, we could run it for another 15 minutes of questions, comments, and concerns till we get an even 2 hours in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's
kind of slowed down.
Yeah, so that's kind of the basics of it. So yeah, so the next episode, and I'm gonna try to, and I say try because I don't know if I'll be successful, but I'll try to have a little bit better of an outline, at least write down dates, so I don't have to have a brain fart in the middle of it and go looking for the date that it happened. But for whatever reason,
excellent. I think when you do it off the top of your head, it makes for a better story.
Yeah, but I'm sitting here kind of feeling dumb because I can't remember the exact date of the freaking Fetterman Massacre. But I'll pull out the book, The Fetterman Massacre, because it should have that in there. Let's see here.
December 6th.
December 6th was the first little foray.
1860s.
December 21st. I knew it was 21st. I don't know why I kept thinking it wasn't.
It's not a day that will live in infamy.
Yeah. So, yeah, December 6th was the first time that Crazy Horse decoyed. Because that's when Grumman got wiped out the first time. Yeah, so December 21st was the day of the big battle. But yeah, the like I said, this one's a really good, and it's a quick read. It's a smaller book. It is, let's see, 229 pages of, and if you count the biography and stuff, it is 251. But they also in the back have a map of the Bozeman Trail. And so this kind of puts it into perspective. And the nice thing is, whoever the previous owner was highlighted a lot of these. So the three forts are actually fairly close together. Right up here is Fort C.F. Smith. Fort Phil Kearny's right down here, and then down here is Fort Reno, where Fort Connor was in 1865. And so, yeah, that kind of gives you the layout. And then Virginia City is way over here on this other side. So this is the area that they consider to be, kind of the hostile territory. That's the area that it's where the buffalo and such were at. And so basically, kind of adding in. So after the fights done after the Fetterman Massacre, I said that the natives broke up. The Lakota are going to head into the Powder River and the Tongue River valleys. So they're not real far away. The Arapaho will head north into the Yellowstone River country. When I say Yellowstone country, I don't mean Yellowstone National Park. I mean Yellowstone River up in Montana, pretty close to Fort C.F. Smith. And the Cheyenne are going to head up into the Bighorn Mountains. And so that's pretty much, like I said, going to be the end of the fighting season at that point, because they had a victory. Why continue on when you've got a pretty good victory under your belt? But at some point in time, we got to get into the Kidder fight, which is going to take place very close to that same time period. And so to kind of tie in everything that's going on, there's not just Red Cloud's War going on. You have fighting still going on down in Kansas. There are Lakotas, members of the Lakota tribes, the Southern Cheyenne, Southern Arapaho, that are still fighting down in Kansas in there. And so Kidder is going to wind up getting killed in 1867. So there's fighting taking place down there, and eventually that will lead to the Washita in 1868, which we touched on when we kind of got into the Southern Plains Wars, which was, I think that was the last episode we did previous to this one. But yeah, we'll read up on this one a little bit. And if anybody's curious, yes, the 7th, a lot of troops down there, if I can find it.
Caleb called me about 3 hours ago, said he was going over the Washita.
Yeah.
So he just commented and said he's 45 minutes from home and enjoyed the history.
Good. So the 7th down there were armed with Remingtons and Spencers. So there were a few Remingtons that were kept in service. Most of those were surplus and the Colts were kept, but they did keep a number of Remingtons. And
that was what year was Washita? 73?
Washita was in 68.
Oh, 68. 73 is Yellowstone campaign. Okay.
Yeah, 73 is the Yellowstone. Yeah, where Custer fights Sitting Bull the first time.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that we did the live stream that's no longer up because we reviewed Son of the Morning Star.
It was fun while it lasted.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
but I didn't feel like risking it.
Yeah, they kind of skip over in that whole Yellowstone campaign. Basically, what that was is they were going to run a rail line up in that part of Montana, and they sent in surveyors, and that part of Montana is where Sitting Bull and them were all hanging out, and because that's where, like I said, the buffalo were at. So yeah, Custer's going to fight him there, and then the following year he's going to be sent down to the Black Hills expedition, where they're going to discover gold, and then he winds up back in North Dakota at Fort Abraham Lincoln, and then in 76, going to start in the campaigns there and be his last campaign when he heads to the Little Bighorn.
Yep. We got a few comments here. Oregon Outback said, when did the other team get their hands on Yellow Boys? I guess that depends on which team you're playing for.
Yeah. So yeah, the Yellow Boy started coming out, of course, 1866. You start seeing them out in the West. 67 in there. John Reshaw Jr. gets a hold of one in 72, along with I think it was one of the other Reshaw brothers. And anyway, he'll get killed shortly after he gets it, but it's an interesting story on that. They buy these new Winchesters, and they have to go to the Red Cloud Agency, and I'm forgetting all the details, and I just read about it not too long ago, but they head up to the Red Cloud Agency, and they take a ferry up there, and as they're taking the ferry down the river, he shoots up all of his ammunition, him and the other guy that had the Winchester. They shoot up all their ammunition, shooting ducks and geese on the river. And so he does have a few bullets left because he does use that to kill Yellow Bear, one of the Oglala chiefs there. That was the father of one of his wives that he gave up and then decided he wanted to have back. And then, of course, he gets killed, and then the other guy doesn't have any ammunition, so they're running around without any bullets to shoot. But yeah, they were starting to pop up and become pretty common even before, or as you start getting into the 1870s. But
I was about to say, you're probably not going to start when you look at the captures, especially on the native side. You don't see, because a lot of that captured stuff is still in books, it's still record, especially the stones sent back to Springfield. You don't see a ton of it and showing up until the mid 1870s on the Indian side. You see Lehman's, like I was just reading you the other day in 79, October of 79, 160 Lehmans were captured in like 8 lever action rifles, and the rest of it was just like Civil War leftover stuff. But yeah, they used muzzleloaders a long time.
For the Little Bighorn, so leading up to that is there was a lot of traders in the area that were trading arms to the natives. One of them was the Rishaws were probably trading some because they were related to Red Cloud. His sister was married to Jean Baptiste Richard, or Rishaw as he was known, who was a trader in the 1840s out here. So his sons would have been Red Cloud's nephews. Were known to possibly be trading arms. The Janice family, who were also mixed blood, were trading arms. In fact, it was stated when Crook come here to hire scouts in 76 that the Janices were not to be hired and trusted because they were known to be trading arms to the natives. Bordeaux's, Jim Bordeaux's mixed blood son, I think it was Louise Bordeaux, he was trading arms. In fact, he was trading them pretty close to where Red Cloud Agency was at, over at a little trading post where the Museum of Fur Trade's at, there at Shadron.
Shadron, Nebraska. Yeah.
He was trading arms, and the Army pretty much shut him down because of it. So they were getting them. And the funny thing is, in 76, the Winchester 73 was still fairly new, and they have found ammunition casings from 8 different Winchester 73s that were on the native side. Now, if I remember right, Tom Custer had a 73, and one of the other guys that was there, I think it was one of the scouts, had a 73. Several others had, earlier model Winchesters. There was a couple of Henrys, and of course the natives had a bunch of Henrys at that point too. But by the time you get into 76, the natives have a lot of cartridge arms. But during Red Cloud's war, they're predominantly still using muzzle loaders. And of course, after the Fetterman fight, they're going to have a handful of Spencers. But repeating cartridge arms, there's not very many around on the native side. They might have 1 or 2 that they'd taken off of somebody they killed, traveler on the trail or such, but they don't have a lot. This war is being fought primarily with muzzle loaders, bows and arrows, and tomahawks and clubs. And lances and knives. But yeah, mostly non-firearm weapons.
Gotzluka said, very interesting, is one whose family came to California by way of the Isthmus of Panama in the 1850s. Not part of my history.
Yeah, there's multiple ways to get to California. You could go overland, you could go by boat, or you can, and by boat you had 2 options. You could go all the way around South America and all the way back up, or you go down to Panama, hike over, get on another boat and come up, which was a little bit shorter because there's no Panama Canal. You just you have to hoof a part of it, but either way, you can get there. And another thing worth noting, when I was talking about the 1864-1865 war, I didn't mention is that the Indians were successful in cutting communication between the East and the West for a couple months. In fact, they shut down the Overland Trail. The government shut down the Overland Trail after the raid at Julesburg. And so mail had to be returned back east, put on a boat, and sent to California by boat.
The long way around.
Yeah, they had to send it the long way around because we don't have a transcontinental railroad yet. That's still in the process of being built. Of course, by 1867, the transcontinental railroad's at Cheyenne. By 69, it's completed. And that's one of the reasons why the government was not worried about shutting down the Bozeman Trail, because by that point, most people weren't even going to go by the Bozeman Trail. They were going to take the rail over to the western side of Wyoming and come into the gold hills or the gold fields from the west instead of from the east.
And Gray Pilgrim said, superb history, guys. I need to go. Trust in God. Yep. Speaking of which, we're about there.
Yeah. So I guess, we'll finish up the comments, or if that's finished up, we can.
I think that's it. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. All right. Well, what do you guys got coming up?
I don't know, because I have a few videos made, but Ethan's been working on one for like 3 weeks, and I don't see it up yet. So I'm gonna assume that tomorrow we're going to be looking at the 69 cadet rifle, but it
Okay.
could be a flintlock. Who knows by that point?
Right. And then your guys' next chat next week's going to be
Small caliber arms review, and hopefully you're there too.
yeah, I should
We
be able to be in on that.
Snapper got that. Let me check it. Snapper's been doing the scheduling on that here recently, so let's see. Nope. Looks like I have Turkey Creek 1823 on that next week. Okay, because we had issues last time, so it looks like he's going to be next week. Yep, and then after that we were going to have the Santa Fe Trail on yours, but I don't know if that's still the plan.
Well, the next one will be Red Cloud's War Part 2.
Okay, yeah, so we will.
And then if I get my act together, we'll do Santa Fe Trail and Tom Tobin.
So small caliber arms reviews on the 27th. Okay.
Yeah. And I may push back the horse meat march again, just because there's the one of the reasons I've been reading up on Red Cloud's War and stuff is this year in August I think we're doing 1866 if I remember right. So trying to kind of get set for that because I think that's kind of be the theme of things. But that and I just need to read up more on Red Cloud's War. But yeah, we will get into the horse meat march. If not sooner, then definitely later on here. But then once I get Santa Fe Trail, Tom Tobin, and horse meat march out of the way, then we'll open it up to voting again.
Now we got the next 30 years to do it.
Right. Yeah, there's no big hurry. One of those things, it's like, being I'm kind of up here and getting back into things, like, might as well talk about the things I'm going to be researching anyway for work.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's going to take care of it there. I want to thank everybody for joining in tonight. I don't know what our peak was because Garrett's got that on his end.
We had over 35 at one point.
Yeah, so it's typical chat night. But anyway, thank you all for joining in. Like I said, we'll do Red Cloud's War Part 2 in 2 weeks, and that should give me plenty of time to get that book read and maybe get through the other books on what was going on there. But yeah, so kind of keep your eye out on things. I don't have anything coming out video wise. I'm going to try to get started doing shorts again if I can get organized here, but mostly it's just going to be whatever I can get when I can get it. But for sure in 2 weeks we'll have Tales of the Trails episode 6, Red Cloud's War Part 2. So until then, y'all take care, stay safe out there, stay tuned, and keep your powder dry.